Welcome to the Spirituality What? Podcast, where we explore the mysteries, joys, and challenges of being spiritual beings navigating our unpredictable human experience we call life here on planet Earth. I'm your friendly guide, Rebecca, ready to jump into our adventure of the day. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Wednesday. Welcome back to the Spirituality What podcast. I am your host, Rebecca, and we are going to get to it today. But before we talk about the episode, I just wanted to let everybody know that I'm doing a special Spirituality What merch Pashmina drop. It's not going to be on the normal website, so reach out to me if you're interested in a Pashmina and I can send you some pictures and we can get things organized. But I'm really excited about this, and if they do pretty well, I'll see what I can do about getting them more officially on the website. For the episode today, we are releasing part one of a two-part episode of Spirituality Through Partnership with Horses with Susan. So as a child, Susan grew up sitting under the horses in the field next to her house in San Francisco. She attended college at the University of California, Davis, graduating with a BS in genetics, and she ended up closing her horse and sales and training business in Southern California and going to South Africa. In South Africa, she found some answers that actually led her to India in 2011, and very quickly an opportunity arose for her to rent a little room down from the ashram that she was going to there. So she ended up staying for a few years, and after those few years, her teacher at the ashram was like, hey, you're ready to go back, and she was really surprised, but she headed back to the horse world. Years of training and teaching continued to unfold in different places, and in 2021, a big change arrived in her life when she had the opportunity to purchase a beautiful 88-acre farm with an arena, a barn, an indoor and an outdoor arena, and complete fencing for 4 rotational pastures. So this big dream came true, and now she had a place to live with horses. So today we are going to get in a little bit of the story of Sue's life and how she got into horses and her path to horses over a few decades, her road to competition and competitive trail riding, which is like 30, 60, or 90 miles, like over weekends on horses, the President's Cup, and dressage. We're going to talk a little bit about that trip to South Africa and on to the ashram in India, and a little bit about her blog. So if you like horses or you're interested in how we can connect to spirituality through horses or potentially other animals, stay with us and we're gonna just get to it. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Spirituality What podcast. I'm Rebecca here today on this wonderful Wednesday with my new acquaintance, Susan. Susan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca, for having me as a guest. This is super cool. I enjoyed listening to your other podcasts, so this is fun.
Oh,
Thank you.
awesome. Yeah.
So just a brief background for me. My whole life has been wrapped around horses. From childhood, when I would sit under horses in the field, they'd come down, there was a big maple tree, and the horses would come down to stand in the shade. So my life started with horses when I could start walking, basically. And it just continued on. And after I graduated from the university, I went off to Europe to learn how to train horses classically for dressage. I grew up doing long distance riding and had the privilege to compete in NATRC and finish the Tevis Cup. And then my journey with learning to train horses, work with horses, even in a circus capacity in France and different countries in Europe, is that they have been just the root of my existence. And so one of the conundrums, my life has been dedicated to improving my technique. I even started to study ballroom dancing for 20 years to improve my own personal awareness, alignment, and feel as a partner, because in a dance situation, you're the horse as the woman. And so a lot of insight from being led, in that position. It helped me to be more sensitive as a leader for the horses. And then in the process of working with horses, it's for me, it's always been about feel, timing, and alignment. So they're these giant beings, that are just a big hub of resonance. And that has been the sensing and the feel, and I would say the spiritual connection. I didn't grow up with religion. And so I didn't even know really
Mm,
spiritual, what is that? But when I look back, the sensing of spirituality through the horses and trying to live in alignment with right action with them has been what has steered me. So even now, I came after I folded up my business in 2011 and moved to India to try to find some deeper answers about myself and humanity. And because I could never quite work out the two-leggeds relative to the four-leggeds, they always were troubling. And so, in going to India and then coming back, I always wanted to, see if that alignment after being in India would improve my feel and timing and helping people align to the horses. But I learned that, again, that's so individual. Each person has to have that
mm,
desire for communication and connection. So before I decided to quit training horses, because I could tell that was kind of coming to an end for me,
gotcha.
I ended up moving to Kentucky and I bought a farm that's 88 acres, and I wanted to know what it was like to be with just horses that weren't being ridden, that I was stewarding as an attendant, and that I could live with them as close as I could to what they needed to be with their friends, to be grazing, to be moving in a large space. And basically, this property, it turns out, also supports an energy portal. So all of the, I would say, the energetics of being here as a steward to the land, steward to the horses, it has again transformed my life. And I have to just thank the horses. They guided me to Kentucky to experience their root needs. And in that process, I've learned to love the earth and working on a program called Self Seeds for Humanity for small or young children. I hope it'll be global one day for them to have personal awareness. And that program actually came from a program called Ride Like a Dancer 20 years ago that was to help riders connect more deeply with horses. So you could see it's this amazing matrix of life with horses and where they've led me on this spiritual journey.
Absolutely. And that is wonderful. So I have one little question that we'll ask before we get to the what does spirituality mean to you question. But so what is dressage? You mentioned that. I feel like maybe you should know what that is, but maybe it's related to horses, but what does that mean?
So dressage is a particular type of style of riding. Like they have jumping and they have,
Gotcha.
Western. And so dressage really ironically is like ballroom dancing for a horse and rider,
Okay.
is that you compete in a rectangle. It's an Olympic event. You compete in a rectangle doing particular movements and you're scored on your quality of your execution and your harmony. And so it's sort of ironic that I did 20 years of ballroom dancing and then quite a long time studying dressage, trying to again work on my harmony with the horse.
Yeah, absolutely. You got it from all angles. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, that's a really great starting point. So now we're going to jump in and switch a little bit of gears, and I'm going to ask you the question that I ask all of our interviewees on this podcast, which is, what does spirituality mean to you?
What a great question. I think the question of what is spirituality, it's like a moving peg. I feel like I live like there's an escalator moving and I say my shoelace is caught in the escalator and I just am constantly moving trying to keep up with the escalator. And so in that alignment to this, I think spirituality is a backbone. And because I started with out really religion or any spiritual sense in my early life, it was just, again, nature and animals, is at this point, what I would identify as a spirituality is that I'm a holographic particle in a holographic wave having a
Nice.
three-dimensional
I
experience.
like that. I like that. We haven't had anybody use that word yet in relationship to spirituality. We've had some references to kind of what that might mean, but awesome. Okay, cool. Well, as Susan kind of kicked us off, we are going to talk about horses today and connection with spirituality and spiritual growth through connection with horses and kind of all that good stuff. So, you talked a little bit about in your introduction already, kind of like you've been involved and had horses in your life for your whole life. So what was it about when you were a kid and you had this kind of connection? What was it about horses that made you want to do competitions? And like we all want to talk about the circus a little bit too because that sounds really interesting.
Mm.
But what made you want to kind of take it to that next level as opposed to just appreciating horses and thinking they're cool, but like really diving into like horsemanship and all of that?
You know, for me, they were just magical, mystical beings. And when my mother would find me sitting under them out in the field, and it terrorized her because my family has nothing to do with horses. So
Mm.
for their small child to be out sitting under these large animals, it was kind of distressful. And then it turned out these horses lived on the other side. We had a forest behind us, a little forest, and there were horses that lived in a stable behind the hill that was the forest. And I would, from childhood, would wander over there and see if I could clean stalls or brush them. And it was just this intense design. And I always constantly was asking, could I get a horse? Could I get a horse? Could I get a horse? And then, for whatever reason, at the age of 10, is that somebody had a horse at that stable that they wanted to lease. So that started my official, and I look back, and
Mm.
it's crazy. Actually, I lived through all of it because my first horse, his name was Mariah, and she was an ex-barrel horse. I had no riding lessons. And so, how it was, I had no saddle. How it was that I survived, when I look back, it's a blur. I survived riding her bareback around the neighborhood, and I used to race cars, and she was so tall that I knew I shouldn't fall off because I couldn't get back on her.
Oh my gosh.
And so it was this wild alchemy. And then because I lived on the horse, it was one of those things, it was a different time where you'd get on the horse on the weekend, and
Yes.
my family would never see me again. And then there were rules, you had to be back by the dinner table at
Yeah,
dark.
exactly.
And in the meantime, so I would spend hours by myself with the horse, just riding, going down to the creek or
Hmm.
wherever there were fields where there were cows, and just everything. Went through the drive through at Taco Bell. I mean, you name it. Just lived with the horse. And so, ironically, somebody just kind of casually introduced this idea. Well, maybe you want to do competitive trail riding. So, the North American Trail Ride Conference was my first endeavor for competition. And it's a sport which is super cool when I look back. It's awesome because it introduces, you're judged on how you present the horse to the vet. Your horse is judged by the vet as a check in. You're judged on your riding abilities over the course of 30, 60, or 90 miles. You're judged on how you stable the horse. So it's this weekend that you spend being judged by a horsemanship judge and a vet to it. So it's all in it's like an immersion, and
Mm.
you camp with your horse.
Oh,
And
that's cool.
I mean, it's so cool. And they hide in the bushes and watch you go by, how your equitation is, your position up and down hills, your safety. And so this horse,
Hmm.
she ended up being brilliant for the sport. And I didn't really know anything, but she right away started winning all the competitions that I took her to. because we had a relationship and I lived with her and she was fit, right? Because I rode her all the time.
Hmm.
So that kind of snowballed, it kind of snowballed. And then eventually in the course, I would think I was 15, my first horse competition is I ended up meeting somebody, I think I was then 16, in the same NATRC. And they said, "Oh, have you ever thought of going for the President's Cup?" I met them competing in Colorado. I'd gone to Southern California. Different horse by this time, a horse called Rudy or Bezaru. But it was still this competitive arc where you're working on perfecting your relationship and harmony with the horse and meeting criteria. And that horse, ironically, ended up leading me to win the President's Cup, which is like the highest award for the sport. And so if you had asked me if that was my goal, it wasn't. It was an evolution. And then that took me competing from California to Georgia, back to California and North Carolina. So I had a chance to learn about the country. I trailered my horse in a little 2-horse trailer with a pickup truck. And it was an amazing experience my senior year in high school. Of course, they let me, do my homework on the road and everything. So that was my jump into competition was this sport and where it led me.
That is really interesting. I had no idea. I know nothing about horse competitions. I'm like, I think I saw a video of dressage, but only because the horse was dancing to like techno music. Like maybe there was like music and they had to do steps or something. And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. But I was like, I don't really know what I'm watching. So that's good. But it's so cool, like a whole weekend where you get to camp out with your horse. That sounds like a very different experience than these, the ones that are kind of in courses, in boxes and things like dressage, for example, very different.
Radically different. And so ironically, when I was in college, I saw a woman riding in dressage and I thought, wow, that's so beautiful. I'd like to technically learn
Mm,
how to ride better. But the mystery for me was I'd already spent, I'm going to say, a long time working on this like relationship with the horse. And when you're out riding anywhere from 50 to 100 miles, you have to really rely on each other in a way that's different. It wasn't like I just put a quarter in the
absolutely.
slot and went. And then a lot of places I was training and riding, they're very narrow, tricky switchbacks, very steep, and all these different terrains. So you're really relying on your horse's judgment and how they navigate all that. And then as a desire to want to help the horse, you want to work on how you carry yourself on the horse, how you balance, how you guide the horse. So I started with that, and it was an interesting journey because that root relationship with the horse, I always felt like that had to be part of my other training when I went to dressage. And then there were some things in the
Mm,
dressage that became points of cruelty and subjugation and repetitiveness
yep.
that I would say really led me to giving up my job training horses and going to India because I couldn't
Yep.
figure out how that I could take my love and passion for the horses and still do justice to what dressage was and be
Mm,
competitive.
yeah. I wrote down a little note kind of as you were talking about that, which is like, I think it sounds like it would be a very different experience if you were a child and you originally got introduced to dressage, and the relationship that you create with the horses in that environment seems very, very different. I can't even imagine. My rear end is like sore just thinking about riding a horse for 50 miles, like let alone I'm like that's like that's a backpacking trip. That's such a unique experience compared to a 2-minute rehearsed choreographed thing, or jumping over a bunch of things, again rehearsed, kind of choreographed. Like it's more like raw, I think maybe is the word that I'm looking for there.
Yeah, I love that. And The thing is, how I really appreciate you kind of gleaning that awareness. And so it's sort of ironic that trying to figure out the Rubik's Cube of that aligning propelled me to
Hmm.
keep searching for deeper answers because it was so raw.
Yeah,
It was so raw.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So why India? What about India? Because that's like a long way to go, right, from the US to be like, oh, I dressage is not working for me. This relationship is different. I need to just go to India.
Well, ironically, what I did as a step before I stopped training horses, I was living in San Diego area at the time and really a wonderful life. I mean, great clients, a good business, ballroom dancing at the top level. I mean, it was phenomenal. But I remember thinking, is this it? Is this really what life is about? So I had a chance to go to South Africa and work on a riding safari. And so while I was riding in South
Ooh,
Africa, yeah, it was amazing because it was a riding safari where you galloped with giraffes and you went and saw lions on horseback. And it was like, so my route beginning riding in a way cross country came out again to be out strategically riding
absolutely. Just
wild
riding in the
animals.
different kind of wilderness. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I was
totally.
kind of testing if it was the dressage that was making me crazy, or if I wanted to try to experience the horses in what I love your word, that raw state again. So in going to South Africa
Hmm.
and working for this group and doing this, I realized it wasn't it was that wasn't going to solve it for me. Is that because there were things
Mm,
going on with the horses and the people that I no, that isn't the answer, even though it was like incredible experience and wouldn't change it for the world. And it gave me
absolutely.
a chance to experience Africa, which was super cool. And then from there, ironically, I'd always followed kind of this self-inquiry process when I since my early 20s, and there was a group that I had known for quite some time. They were going to India to meet this spiritual master. And I was kind of like, what is that about? I don't do robed beings. I don't read much, I mean. And then there was a teacher that led them there that had me read about Ramana Maharshi because he liked animals. You know, he actually had a whole
Hmm.
relationship with the animals that visited him. So, all right, I kind of see that. And then they segued me on to Ramakrishna, and then okay, I kind of see what this is about. So those two books or two beings. So when I showed up in India, it was really I couldn't see any other way to go forward in life. So it was sort of ironic to be in the middle of the bush in South Africa and have everything come together that in 2 or 3 days I was in India. Completely never had India on my
Wow.
to-do list. It's those magical moments. And, you walk out and there's cows walking on the street. I mean, it's just so different. But luckily,
It is.
I had done a lot of traveling and being resourceful, so it was kind of like, well, we're having another adventure. And so that led me, and then those first 10 days with the group there were so profound and life-changing. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know how I was going to sit still because I wasn't a meditator. I'm a very high energy person. I take care of this 88 acres by myself. I was like, I don't know how this is going to work, but my life has led me now to this place in this moment with this group, right?
Yeah.
But there were so many profound things that happened that after the 10 days, I remember thinking, I don't know yet what this is all about, but I feel like I need to move back here and just immerse myself in whatever this is.
Mm.
And so then that's when I went home and sold some of the horses and, helped relocate my clients. And yeah, I mean, these blind just kind of leap off into the world. It's fun though.
I think it's a great
Very
example.
fortunate, to
Yeah,
have a chance.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a good example of flow. And I think that I get goosebumps talking about this. That happens a lot in this podcast. but I think it's a great example when you say, like, with just 3 days notice, you're doing this thing that you all of a sudden were like, I have to be in India. And it's like, if that wasn't the right thing to do, it wouldn't have worked out like that. Like, ooh, big old goosebumps. But it's like, that's a perfect example. So what did you take away from India when I think you were there for a couple years or 3 years, right?
I've gone on and off since 2011.
Okay.
It was just in the beginning, the first couple of years, it was more of a deep dive, renounce your life, you know, every day sitting at the ashram twice a day and, having this life transforming experience. One thing with India, it's so different. In America, things are kind of orderly and we have fences and, things are kind of structured. And in India, it's so different.
It is.
And it was super cool because it happened to be that the ashram had a place where the tourism elephants lived and walked by every day, and the camels. And then, of course, you have all the cows everywhere, which are fun to, and then dogs and monkeys and, everything's going on. It's like living in the zoo. It's fun because I love dancing so much. And I would every day go for, 3 or 4 hour walks. So I'd go up in the hills and through the cities, and then to have this thread of animals in the process there. Ironically, I have to share this, is it really was, I was thinking, what am I doing? This is so strange, but actually the teacher, I called him Gurudev, he looked at me one day and he said, all your work with horses has prepared you for this.
Interesting.
And I almost fell over because I had not, the pain from the horse world. And, you have to be very structured with the horse world and very detailed, if you want to have success in it.
Absolutely.
And so, in a way, the self-discipline from caring for the horses and then working on competition and fulfilling the client's needs and running a business, it sort of structured me for this process. And then also with the toughness of living, training horses and managing horses is a very physical lifestyle.
Absolutely.
And so
yes.
all of that, brought everything together. And then my journey, because of what you noted, being a child in the pasture with the horses, that rawness never left me, even today. And so I always am looking at resonance and feel. So in India, in those deep points of meditation, where you're going places where you don't have you're not a body anymore. You don't really have a mind. You might have a witness. When all of that very odd stuff was going on, it was still based on a very deep resonance. And that resonance was what I used for communication with sensing the horses.
Yeah, I like that. So I of course I do prep. We've talked about that before on this podcast. And I wrote down this quote from your blog, and I want to say it because it was really impactful. I looked at a lot of things from your blog and pictures from India, and it did look like it was really fun. But you had this thing that you said, I've always worked with horses from a standpoint of helping them to develop their maximum conscious capabilities so that they are part of the partnership instead of a vehicle for my egoic expression. And I feel like that is so beautiful. Like, I'm like almost tearing up. Like, I love that sentence. It's everything that you've kind of talked about as well. It's like, I'm like, dressage, is that egoic expression? I'm like, let's break down this sentence. Like, this is like really interesting. But I love that you were prepared for your India experience because of your work with horses. And I had this visual, again, when you were talking about that raw nature, like I imagine like, it's a lot like a track, somebody who runs on a track versus somebody who runs like a trail run. Like it's just a completely different set of skills, completely different set of muscles. But then when you add a horse, like what other sports, I'm trying to like rack my brain, what other sports are like that? Where we're using animals in that way, not just like dogs. Okay, dog shows, the same as like, horse shows, but that do this sort of more raw, long distance. Like, are there? Are there any sports that have animals like that use animals like that? Yeah, okay. Susan shaking her head.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, there's very long competitions like in Mongolia and things, but it's still horses. And even though that some places ride
Yeah.
reindeers and and maybe oxen and things like that, it's still
Mm,
I'm not thinking that they race on them or that it's so distant, you know
yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
So I love your observations. This
Hmm.
is so
Yeah.
fun. And I can't believe I almost started crying when you read that quote because where I am right now in my path,
It's
I'm like, who said that? Who said that quote? You know?
you
I know,
did.
but it's so crazy that you
Said
resonated
that.
with that quote. I haven't looked at that blog for a while because I've been doing self seeds. And so for you to say that, that like does, I have
Hmm.
to put that on my tombstone one day.
Pretty much. Like it's a really good one, Susan. You killed it when you wrote that.
But I mean, you dug that out. So, I mean, that's just so cool that you dug that out of all of the things.
I
So
did.
thank you for reminding me. Yeah.
Of course. It was literally the first blog post I clicked on. Like, I couldn't I looked at other things, but I was like, "Wow, that's crazy that I just randomly of the hundreds of blog posts that you
Yeah.
have, that I randomly clicked on the one that had that quote in it." I was like, "This is pretty
But see, that
awesome."
is like going to India in 2 or 3 days, right? That's the magic. That's the
Yes.
flow, as you called
Yes.
it, right? I mean, that's I live in that. It's the magic
That's
out there that
awesome.
happens in the design.
That's awesome. All right, everybody, that is a wrap for today. Part 2 will be released next week, and it will be the finish of this episode with Susan and horses, and we will see you then. Thank you for joining me on today's Spirituality What? Adventure. Subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. Visit us on Instagram at spirituality.what to interact, tell us what spirituality means to you, and even provide some of your own personal musings. Human on, you phenomenal spiritual beings.